5 plantation houses burned to ash across Virginia's Tidewater region during a 17-month period that local authorities deliberately erased from county records. Each fire started in the master's private chambers after midnight. Each master died alone in his bed, surrounded by flames that investigators described as moving with unnatural purpose through hallways and staircases. The only common thread authorities could identify was a single enslaved woman whose name appeared in the property ledgers of all 5 estates, though official documents listed her under different names at each location. What Virginia's plantation elite discovered about this woman's method terrified them so profoundly that they conspired to bury every trace of her existence, fearing the knowledge itself could ignite similar acts of destruction across the entire South. Before we continue with the story of Virginia's most dangerous enslaved woman, I want you to do something important. That if you're fascinated by dark historical mysteries that were deliberately hidden from public memory, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this. And tell me in the comments what state or city are you listening from right now. I love knowing where our community of history lovers is located. Now, let's uncover what really happened in those plantation houses. The records that survived Virginia's deliberate purge suggest this woman first appeared in Richmond's slave market during the autumn of 1847, though her actual origins remain deliberately obscured. What plantation ledgers did preserve tells us she was approximately 23 years old when she stepped onto the auction block at 15th and Franklin Streets, where Richmond's largest slave trading houses conducted their business beneath the shadow of the state capitol building. The auctioneer's surviving notes describe her with clinical precision that reveals more about the buyer's interests than the woman herself. Light-skinned enough to work indoors, educated enough to read and write, beautiful enough to command premium prices from planters seeking what they euphemistically called fancy girls for household service. Richmond slave market in 1847 functioned as the commercial heart of Virginia's most profitable industry. The city had transformed itself into the primary distribution center for enslaved people, moving through the domestic trade that followed cotton's expansion westward. Traders purchased enslaved individuals from exhausted tobacco plantations across Virginia and Maryland, then resold them to cotton planters in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. The transactions generated enormous wealth for Richmond's merchant class, who built elegant town houses along Gray Street and Franklin Street with money earned from human commerce. The auction houses themselves occupied substantial brick buildings near Show Bottom, where Thessady's commercial district met the James River's shipping channels. Inside these buildings, potential buyers examined enslaved people with the same calculating attention they applied to livestock or machinery. They checked teeth, examined hands for calluses that indicated field experience, asked questions about skills and temperament. The entire process reduced human beings to commercial property with prices varying based on age, health, skill level, and for women, appearance. The woman, who would later burn 5 plantation houses, entered this degrading system with advantages that made her simultaneously valuable and vulnerable. Her light skin suggested mixed ancestry, which in Virginia's racial hierarchy meant she could serve in plantation houses rather than fields. Her literacy marked her as unusually educated since teaching enslaved Pueblo Red violated Virginia law. Her beauty attracted attention from planters seeking women for purposes that polite society refused to acknowledge openly, but everyone understood perfectly. A planter named Harold Sutherland purchased her for $200, a price that exceeded typical market rates by $300. Sutherland owned Riverside Estate, a tobacco plantation off 800 acres along the James River, approximately 15 miles east of Richmond. His wife had died 3 years earlier from complications following childbirth. His 2 surviving daughters lived with relatives in Charlottesville, leaving Sutherland alone in a house designed for entertaining that now stood mostly empty. Plantation records indicate Sutherland registered his purchase under the name Clara Era, though whether this was the name she had carried previously or one he assigned her remains unknown. The registration paperwork classified her as household staff, specifically listing her duties as domestic service and personal attendance to the master. This phrase carried implications that Virginia's planter class understood, but never stated explicitly in official documents. Riverside Estate represented typical upper-tier plantation architecture of Virginia's Tidewater region. The main house rose 3 stories in the federal style with tall windows and brick construction that demonstrated Sutherland's wealth and social position. Separate buildings housed the kitchen, laundry, carriage house, and slave quarters, a village unto itself that processed the agricultural labor sustaining the entire operation. Tobacco fields stretched toward the river, where Sutherland's private dock facilitated shipping to Richmond's warehouses and ultimately to markets in Europe. The household enslaved community numbered 23 people when Clara arrived, with clear hierarchies separating house servants from field workers. The house staff consisted of 7 individuals whose proximity to the master's family granted them slightly better living conditions and marginally less brutal treatment than those working in the tobacco fields. This proximity also exposed them to the master's moods, demands, and appetites in ways fieldworkers avoided. Clara entered this environment with careful attention to social dynamics governing plantation life. She observed how the overseer, Thomas Wickham, wielded authority through violence and intimidation. She noted which house servants held influence with Sutherland, and which had fallen from favor. She identified the plantation's rhythm: when Sutherland conducted business in Richmond, when he entertained neighboring planters, when he remained alone in the house with only immediate household staff nearby. Most importantly, she recognized what Sutherland wanted from her, and she made the calculated decision to provide it while pursuing her own purposes. The relationship between Clara and Harold Sutherland developed according to patterns common throughout the antebellum South, though discussing these patterns violated social taboos that insisted on maintaining fictions about plantation life. Sutherland installed Clara in a second-floor bedroom adjacent to his own chambers, a location that announced her status to the entire household. She ate meals prepared separately from other enslaved people. She wore dresses made from fabric purchased in Richmond rather than the rough cloth issued to field workers. She attended Sutherland when he read in his library each evening, sitting near the fireplace while he worked through correspondence or ledgers. The nature of their relationship shocked Noon, familiar with plantation society. Virginia's slave codes gave masters absolute legal authority over enslaved people, including authority to demand sexual access without legal consequence. The children born from these relationships lived as enslaved property despite their paternity. The entire system operated on violence and coercion while simultaneously demanding that everyone pretend the violence and coercion did not exist. Clara navigated this environment with careful calculation. She encouraged Sutherland's attachment while gradually expanding her influence within the household. She suggested menu changes that the cook implemented. She advised about fabrics and furnishings when Sutherland considered renovations. She listened attentively when he discussed business frustrations with tobacco prices or shipping delays. Within 6 months, she had become effectively indispensable to his daily life. This influence extended to financial matters. Clara had learned to read and write before arriving at Riverside Estate, skills she now deployed while helping Sutherland organize his increasingly chaotic bookkeeping. She transcribed correspondence, filed business documents, maintained household accounts. This access revealed detailed information about Sutherland's financial situation, specifically the mounting debts threatening to destroy his entire operation. Tobacco cultivation had exhausted Virginia's soil after 2 centuries of intensive farming. Production declined while operating costs continued rising. Many Virginia planters faced financial catastrophe, unable to generate sufficient revenue from depleted fieldstow service debts accumulated during more prosperous decades. Sutherland had borrowed heavily to purchase additional land and enslaved people during the 1830s, expecting cotton prices would remain high. Instead, prices fell while his debts compounded. The papers Clara organized revealed the full extent of Sutherland's desperation. He owed significant sums to Richmond banks. He had missed payment deadlines that would soon trigger foreclosure proceedings. His remaining assets consisted primarily of land, buildings, and enslaved people, all of which would be liquidated if creditors forced a sale. Clara recognized opportunity in this crisis. She began making subtle suggestions about Sutherland's business affairs, couching her advice in language that made him believe the ideas originated with him. She mentioned hearing other planters discuss crop diversification. She commented on newspaper articles about agricultural improvements. She asked innocent-seeming questions about his properties and assets that prompted him to explain his situation in greater detail. Then she introduced the idea that would ultimately lead to his death. One evening in late April 1848, while reviewing ledgers in Sutherland's study, Clara mentioned she had overheard the overseer discussing fire insurance. Sutherland, distracted by troubling correspondence from his bank, barely registered the comment. Clara let the topic rest for several days before mentioning it again. This time, noting that a neighboring plantation had recently received substantial compensation after lightning struck their tobacco barn. The seed planted, Clara waited while Sutherland's financial desperation pushed him toward increasingly reckless solutions. Within 2 weeks, he had purchased fire insurance covering Riverside Estates buildings and tobacco inventory at valuation significantly exceeding their actual worth. The insurance company based in Philadelphia conducted only cursory inspections before issuing policies. Their agents never suspected that Sutherland intended to burn his own property to collect insurance payments that would satisfy his creditors. Clara understood Sutherland's intention perfectly because she had guided him toward it through carefully orchestrated conversations. She also understood that any suspicious fire would bring investigators who might discover evidence of insurance fraud. What Sutherland never realized was that Clara had no intention of letting him survive long enough to collect any insurance payment. On the night of June 16, 1848, Clara ensured that Sutherland drank more wine than usual during supper. She encouraged him to remain in his study rather than retiring early, keeping his glass filled while discussing his plans for the insurance proceeds. She expressed admiration for his business acumen, praising his cleverness in finding a solution to his financial difficulties. She let him believe she was completely devoted to him, dependent on his success for her own security. Past midnight, after Sutherland had finally stumbled to his bedroom, Clara moved through the house with careful precision. She had spent 7 months memorizing every door, hallway, and staircase. She knew which floorboards creaked and which servants slept heavily enough that noise would not wake them. She knew the overseer stayed in a separate building near the slave quarters, too distant to notice anything happening in the main house until flames became visible from outside. Clara started the fire in Sutherland's study, using lamp oil to accelerate the flames along the wooden floor and up the curtains. She ensured the fire would spread rapidly through the first floor before ascending the main staircase. Then she moved to the second floor where she started a second fire in Sutherland's bedroom. While he slept in drunken unconsciousness, she used more lamp oil, creating a barrier of flames around his bed that would prevent any possibility of escape. She left through the servant staircase at the rear of the house, emerging into the kitchen yard, where she began screaming for help. By the time other enslaved people reached the main house, flames were already visible through first-floor windows. The heat had grown too intense for anyone to enter through any door or ground-floor window. Sutherland died alone in his bed, surrounded by fire that consumed the room with terrible efficiency. The investigation that followed concluded the fire had started accidentally, possibly from a lamp knocked over in the study. Sutherland's intoxication explained why he had failed to wake or escape. The insurance company, after briefly considering the timing suspicious, ultimately paid out the full policy value to Sutherland's creditors and distant relatives. Clara disappeared from Riverside Estate during the confusion following the fire. The overseer reported her missing, assuming she had fled in panic and would eventually return or be captured. But Clara had already reached Richmond, carrying forged freedom papers and a small amount of money stolen from Sutherland's desk before the fire started. She had killed her first master. For more would follow before Virginia's plantation elite finally understood the threat she represented. Clara's second appearance occurred in Albemarle County, approximately 70 miles northwest of Richmond during the late summer of 1848. She arrived in Charlottesville using the name Sarah, traveling with papers identifying her as a free woman of color employed as a domestic servant. The forged documents created by a free black printer in Richmond, who produced such papers for escaping enslaved people, would not survive careful scrutiny, but functioned adequately for casual encounters with authorities. Charlottesville in 1848 served as Albemarle County's commercial center and the home of the University of Virginia, established by Thomas Jefferson 2 decades earlier. Thetown's population included substantial numbers of both enslaved and free black residents. The latter community numbering several hundred individuals working as craftsmen, laborers, and domestic servants. This free black community provided cover for Clara's presence, though she remained constantly alert for slave catchers who regularly kidnapped free black people for sale into slavery. She found employment with a planter named Marcus Dalton, whose estate of 600 acres produced wheat and corn on land that had once grown tobacco before soil depletion forced crop rotation. Dalton, a widower of 53, required household help after his previous housekeeper left to marry. Clara's refined manners, literacy, and apparent freedom made her attractive to Dalton, who preferred educated servants capable of managing his household's complex operations. Dalton operated his plantation with slightly more restraint than some of his neighbors, though this relative moderation still encompassed brutal treatment by any moral standard. He employed 14 enslaved workers, primarily in the fields, but several in household roles. He used an overseer named Patrick Henley, who believed in consistent discipline rather than spectacular violence, though he would resort to the whip when he deemed it necessary. Dalton himself participated in Charlottesville's intellectual circles, attending university lectures and hosting dinners where guests discussed philosophy, literature, and politics, while enslaved people served food and wine. Clara adapted quickly to Dalton's household, demonstrating the same attentive service she had provided at Riverside Estate. She managed the household accounts, supervised meal preparation, and attended to Dalton's personal needs with efficiency that soon made her indispensable. Dalton appreciated her intelligence and education, qualities that allowed them to converse about topics beyond household management. He began keeping her company during evening hours, initially for practical discussions about household affairs, gradually expanding to conversations about his business concerns and personal frustrations. The progression from employer to intimate relationship followed patterns Clara recognized from her time with Sutherland. Dalton initially maintained proper boundaries, conscious of social expectations regarding relationships between white men and black women, even supposedly free ones. But isolation, loneliness, and Clara's careful attention gradually eroded these boundaries. Within 3 months, she had moved from the servants' quarters into rooms on the main house's second floor. Within 4 months, Dalton had begun visiting her bedroom at night. Clara had identified Dalton's vulnerabilities during her first weeks at the estate. He carried profound guilt about slavery's moral implications, frequently expressing doubts about the institution of Clara, while simultaneously depending on enslaved labor for his wealth. He drank heavily, using alcohol to suppress the cognitive dissonance between his philosophical beliefs and his economic practices. He had poor relationships with his adult children who had moved to Baltimore and Philadelphia to escape what they considered their father's hypocrisy. Most importantly, Dalton had recently borrowed money to purchase additional enslaved workers, gambling that expanded wheat production would generate sufficient revenue to repay the loans. The gamble had failed. Wheat prices had fallen below his projections while operating costs remained constant. Heno faced financial pressure similar to Sutherland's situation, though not yet as desperate. Clara encouraged Dalton's drinking while simultaneously positioning herself as his confidant and advisor. She listened sympathetically when he expressed frustration about his debts. She suggested solutions that seemed to emerge naturally from conversation rather than deliberate manipulation. She mentioned an article she had read about planters diversifying their income through timber sales. She asked questions about his properties in used forest land. She planted ideas that would germinate over weeks and months. She also cultivated relationships with Dalton's enslaved workers, particularly a woman named Ruth, who worked in the kitchen. Ruth had arrived at the estate 5 years earlier after being sold away from her children in South Carolina. She hated Dalton with intense focus, though she concealed this hatred behind the mask of compliance that enslaved people wore to survive. Clara recognized Ruth's rage and began carefully building trust through late-night conversations in the kitchen. Clara never explicitly discussed her plans with Ruth. Instead, she asked questions about the estate's routines, about the overseer's habits, about which buildings contained flammable materials. She mentioned fires she had heard about at other plantations, discussing how such disasters affected everyone on the property. She created a relationship built on mutual understanding without ever stating explicit intentions. On February 9, 1849, a fire destroyed Marcus Dalton's main house during early morning hours. The blaze started in the library on the first floor, consuming thousands of books before spreading through adjoining rooms and up the central staircase. Dalton died in his second-floor bedroom, apparently overcome by smoke before flames reached him. The investigation attributed his death to intoxication. He had been drinking heavily the previous evening and likely failed to wake when smoke began filling the house. Clara had left the estate 2 days before the fire, traveling east toward Richmond with forged documents and money stolen from Dalton's desk. She later told Ruth she was visiting family, a plausible explanation that aroused no suspicion. Ruth confirmed this timeline when investigators questioned the household staff, noting that Sarah, as they knew Clara, had departed well before the fire started. What investigators never discovered was that Clara had spent her final week at the estate preparing the library for combustion. She had moved the most flammable books to lower shelves near the fireplace. She had soaked certain curtains with lamp oil in quantities too small to notice. She had loosened the library door's latch so it would swing freely rather than providing any barrier to the fire's spread. She had arranged materials to ensure the fire would consume the first floor rapidly before climbing the stairs to Dalton's bedroom. Most critically, she had prepared a specific set of instructions for Ruth, delivered through conversations that never explicitly acknowledged what would happen, but left no doubt about Clara's expectations. Ruth, motivated by her own rage and grief over her lost children, had followed these instructions precisely on the night Clara specified. She had started a fire in the library fireplace using materials Clara had positioned strategically. She had ensured the fire spread to the prepared books and curtains. She had locked Dalton's bedroom door from the outside before descending to the first floor and exiting through the kitchen. By the time house servants noticed smoke and flames, the fire had progressed beyond any possibility of intervention. Dalton died trapped in his bedroom, pounding on a door Ruth had sealed from the hallway. The smoke had disoriented him before flames consumed the second floor. His death appeared to result from tragic accident compounded by his own intoxication and the poor timing of Clara's absence. Ruth remained at the estate after the fire, her involvement never suspected. Clara had protected her by establishing a timeline that placed Clara away from the property when the fire started. Ruth continued working in Dalton's estate. It was liquidated to pay his debts, eventually purchased by a neighboring planter who knew nothing of her role in the fire. Clara had killed her second master, this time without being present when the fire occurred. She had refined her method, using another enslaved woman's rage as a weapon while protecting that woman from discovery. She was learning, adapting, becoming more dangerous with each successful killing. 3 more plantation houses would burn before Virginia's elite finally comprehended what they faced. Clara appeared next in the records of Brunswick County along Virginia's southern border with North Carolina during the spring of 1849. She traveled under the name Rachel, again carrying forged free papers and claiming employment history with respectable families now conveniently deceased or relocated. Brunswick County specialized in tobacco cultivation despite soil exhaustion across much of Virginia, with planters desperately extracting whatever productivity remained in their fields before economic collapse forced them to abandon farming entirely. She found employment with Lawrence Pritchard, who operated a plantation of 400 acres that had been in his family for 3 generations. Pritchard, age 46, had inherited substantial debts along with the property. His father had borrowed heavily during the 1830s to purchase enslaved workers and expand production, gambling that tobacco prices would remain high. Instead, prices had fallen while debts compounded with interest. Pritchard now struggled to generate sufficient revenue to service these inherited obligations while maintaining the lifestyle his social position demanded. The plantation employed 19 enslaved workers, most in the tobacco fields, but several in household roles. Pritchard maintained the property with his wife Catherine and their 3 children, a family structure that initially complicated Clara's usual methods. She could not simply position herself as a replacement for her absent wife or as a companion for a lonely widower. She had to navigate a more complex household dynamic while identifying vulnerabilities she could exploit. Catherine Pritchard provided the opening Clara needed. Catherine suffered from respiratory ailments that frequently confined her to bed for days or weeks at a time. These illnesses, possibly tuberculosis, though never formally diagnosed, had left her weak and irritable. She resented her confinement, resented her husband's financial stress, resented the plantation life that trapped her in rural Virginia rather than the Richmond social circle she had enjoyed before marriage. Clara offered Catherine sympathy and practical assistance. She helped manage the household during Catherine's periods of illness, ensuring meals appeared on schedule and children received proper attention. She prepared Catherine's medicines, administered treatments prescribed by the doctor who visited monthly from Laurinville, and sat with Catherine during particularly difficult nights. She made herself indispensable to Catherine while simultaneously cultivating Lawrence Pritchard's gratitude for relieving him of his wife's constant needs and complaints. The relationship between Clara and Lawrence Pritchard developed differently than her previous situations. She maintained proper boundaries, never suggesting anything inappropriate, while Catherine remained alive and present in the house. She positioned herself as a trustworthy servant, someone reliable and discreet, who understood the family's difficulties without judgment. She listened when Lawrence discussed his financial troubles, offering only sympathetic attention rather than advice. She created an image of complete loyalty to the household. Catherine Pritchard died in November 1849 after a particularly severe illness that lasted 3 weeks. The doctor attributed her death to consumption, noting that her lungs had deteriorated beyond recovery. The family mourned appropriately, hosting a funeral attended by neighboring planters and their families. Clara remained in the background during these ceremonies, maintaining her role as devoted household servant rather than seeking attention. Lawrence Pritchard's grief lasted approximately 6 weeks before practical considerations displaced emotional responses. He found himself managing a household with 3 children and no wife, struggling with financial obligations while trying to maintain agricultural production. Clara stepped naturally into the role of household manager, supervising other servants while handling accounts and correspondence. Lawrence came to depend on her competence the way he had when Catherine was alive, but incapacitated. The progression from dependence to intimacy occurred gradually over the following months. Lawrence began seeking Clara's company during evening hours, initially for household discussions that gradually expanded to include his business concerns and personal frustrations. He appreciated her intelligence, her discretion, and her apparent devotion to his family's welfare. By spring 1850, Clara had moved into rooms on the 2nd floor. By summer, Lawrence was visiting her bedroom with regularity that shocked noon in the household, despite its scandalous implications. Clara had again positioned herself at the center of a plantation owner's life with access to his financial records and intimate knowledge of his vulnerabilities. She discovered that Lawrence's situation was even more desperate than Sutherland's or Dalton's had been. He owed money to multiple creditors and faced foreclosure within months if he could not generate substantial cash payments. His tobacco crop had failed 2 consecutive seasons due to weather and pest damage. His remaining assets consisted primarily of enslaved people who would be sold at auction if creditors forced liquidation. Most importantly, Clara discovered that Lawrence had recently purchased fire insurance at valuations exceeding his property's actual worth. He had done this independently before Clara arrived at the plantation as part of a desperate strategy to generate cash through insurance fraud. He discussed this plan with Clara during late-night conversations, explaining that he intended to burn one of his tobacco barns to collect insurance payments. He never intended to burn the main house, only the barn, making the fire appear accidental while collecting enough money to satisfy his most pressing creditors. Clara recognized the same opportunity she had exploited with Sutherland. She encouraged Lawrence's plan while subtly suggesting modifications that would make the fire appear more convincingly accidental. She asked questions about the barn's contents and the insurance policy's specific language. She mentioned that fires sometimes spread unpredictably, particularly when wind conditions were unfavorable. She planted ideas that would shape Lawrence's thinking without ever explicitly stating her own intentions. On the night of September 12, 1850, Lawrence Pritchard burned his tobacco barn as planned. He had sent his children to relatives in Lawrenceville for several days, ensuring they would be safely away from the property when the fire occurred. He had dismissed most of the household servants for the evening, keeping only essential staff nearby. He had positioned himself in his study with witnesses who could confirm he was nowhere near the barn when flames became visible. What Lawrence had not planned was the fire spreading to the main house. Clara had spent weeks preparing for this eventuality, weakening structural connections between buildings, positioning flammable materials along potential fire paths, and ensuring that wind conditions on the chosen night would carry embers directly toward the main house. When the barn fire started, Clara subtly guided its spread by opening specific windows and doors that created airflow channels directing flames toward the house. By the time Lawrence realized the fire was spreading beyond his control, smoke had filled the main house's first floor. He attempted to evacuate through the front entrance, but found the door jammed. Clara had sabotaged the lock earlier that day. He tried the rear entrance, discovering it similarly blocked. As smoke filled the rooms and flames climbed the exterior walls, Lawrence understood too late that he had been trapped in his own planned fraud. Headed on the first floor near the main staircase, overcome by smoke before flames consumed his body. The investigation concluded that the barn fire had spread unexpectedly to the main house due to unfavorable wind conditions, that Lawrence had attempted to fight the fire rather than evacuating immediately, and that he had succumbed to smoke before reaching safety. Some investigators suspected insurance fraud regarding the barn fire, but could prove nothing. The insurance company paid out the full policy value to Lawrence's children and creditors. Clara had disappeared before the fire started, having left the plantation earlier that evening with a plausible story about visiting the market town. She was nowhere near the property when flames became visible. Her absence confirmed by multiple witnesses who saw her in Lawrenceville. She had again created a perfect timeline that eliminated her from suspicion while allowing her to orchestrate a plantation owner's death through his own planned criminal activity. She had killed her third master, each death appearing more obviously accidental than the last, while actually representing increasingly sophisticated planning. She was refining her methods, learning from each killing, becoming a more efficient predator. Moving through Virginia's plantation country, the pattern finally became visible during the autumn of 1851 after fires destroyed 2 more plantation houses in quick succession. One in Pennsylvania County near the North Carolina border, one in Caroline County between Richmond and Fredericksburg. Both fires killed the plantation owners in circumstances eerily similar to the previous incidents. Both owners had recently purchased fire insurance. Both had employed a light-skinned, enslaved, or supposedly free black woman in household service within the months preceding the fires. Both women had disappeared before or during the fires, their whereabouts unaccounted for when investigators asked questions. A magistrate in Caroline County named Edward Hutchinson recognized the pattern first. He had investigated the Caroline County fire and had obtained records from the previous incidents through correspondence with officials in other counties. When he assembled the timeline, the connections became unmistakable. 5 fires in 17 months, 5 dead plantation owners, 5 missing women whose descriptions matched closely enough to suggest they might be the same person using different names and forged free papers. Hutchinson brought his findings to Virginia's Governor John Floyd in Richmond. Floyd convened a confidential meeting with magistrates, county sheriffs, and prominent planters from the affected regions. The meeting occurred in the governor's mansion on December 3, 1851, with participants instructed to maintain absolute secrecy about the discussion and its conclusions. The evidence Hutchinson presented terrified the assembled officials. They recognized immediately that they faced something unprecedented and profoundly dangerous. An enslaved or formerly enslaved woman had developed a method for killing plantation owners that appeared almost completely undetectable. She had moved through 5 different counties, adapting her identity and approach to each situation, leaving minimal evidence connecting the incidents. She had exploited the plantation owners' own criminal intentions regarding insurance fraud, turning their illegal plans into death traps. Most terrifyingly, she might still be operating somewhere in Virginia, preparing to kill again. The political implications were catastrophic. Virginia's entire economic and social system depended on maintaining absolute control over enslaved populations. If news spread that an enslaved woman had successfully killed 5 masters and escaped punishment, it could inspire similar acts across the state. The psychological impact alone, demonstrating that enslaved people could successfully resist and take revenge, threatened the foundations of plantation society. News of these killings could not be allowed spread beyond the small circle of officials who already knew about them. Governor Floyd made a decision that would shape Virginia's response to Clarara's murders. He ordered all public records related to the fires to be altered or destroyed. Death certificates would attribute the plantation owners' deaths to accidental causes without mentioning any suspicious circumstances. Insurance investigations would be quietly closed without publication. Any newspaper coverage would emphasize tragic accidents rather than potential criminal activity. County magistrates would cease active investigations while maintaining quiet surveillance for any woman matching Clarara's description. Most controversially, Floyd decided against issuing public warnings about Clarara distributing her description through normal channels for capturing escaped enslaved people. He feared that widespread knowledge of her success would cause more damage than her continued freedom. Better to handle the situation quietly through confidential networks of planters and law enforcement, hoping to capture her without ever publicly acknowledging what she had done. This decision sealed the fate of Clarara's future victims. Without public warnings, plantation owners had no way to recognize the danger she represented. Floyd had prioritized protecting the image of slavery's invincibility over protecting individual slaveholders' lives. The confidential meeting concluded with instructions to all participants: maintain surveillance, share information through private channels, and never discuss the matter in any public forum. Hutchinson returned to Caroline County frustrated but bound by orders he could not disobey. The other officials dispersed to their respective jurisdictions, carrying knowledge they could not share. Clarara, unaware that her pattern had been identified, continued operating according to her proven methods. She appeared in Southampton County during early 1852 using the name Hannah and carrying free papers that identified her as a domestic servant seeking employment. Southampton County occupied Virginia's southeastern corner, a region where Nat Turner's rebellion had occurred 20 years earlier, an uprising that resulted in the deaths of approximately 60 white residents before militia forces suppressed the rebellion and executed the participants. The rebellion's memory haunted Southampton County, making white residents perpetually suspicious of enslaved people while simultaneously intensifying the brutal control mechanisms designed to prevent future uprisings. Clarara found employment with Walter Kensington, who owned a plantation of 300 acres producing cotton and corn. Kensington was younger than Clarara's previous targets, only 38 years old. Both shared their essential characteristics: recent widowhood following his wife's death in childbirth, mounting debts from agricultural failures, and isolation that made him vulnerable to Clarara's methods. The situation developed along familiar patterns. Clara established herself as indispensable to Kensington's household management. She cultivated his trust and eventually his affection. She gained access to his financial records and discovered the same desperate circumstances she had found with previous victims. Kensington had borrowed money he could not repay and faced foreclosure within months. What made this situation different was the presence of Kensington's younger brother, Jonathan, who lived in Richmond and visited the plantation regularly. Jonathan had fought in the Mexican War and possessed military training that made him more observant and suspicious than typical plantation owners. During a visit in March 1852, he noticed details about Hannah that troubled him. Her educated manner of speaking, her literacy exceeding what he expected from a supposedly self-taught domestic servant, certain gaps in her personal history when he asked probing questions about her background. Jonathan's suspicions intensified when he noticed his brother's growing attachment to Hannah. He recognized the relationship's nature despite both parties maintaining careful discretion. He understood that his brother's judgment was compromised by loneliness and desperation. Most importantly, he had heard rumors through Richmond social circles about magistrates investigating suspicious fires at various plantations. Though the rumors remained vague because of Governor Floyd's suppression efforts, Jonathan confronted Walter privately, warning him that Hannah might not be what she claimed. Walter dismissed his concerns, insisting that Jonathan was imagining problems that did not exist. The confrontation created tension between the brothers, with Walter ultimately ordering Jonathan to leave the plantation and stop interfering in household affairs. Jonathan left, but continued investigating. He traveled to Caroline County and spoke with Edward Hutchinson, who shared limited information about the suspicious fires and the woman who might be connected to him. Jonathan obtained physical descriptions from the previous incidents and recognized enough similarities to become convinced that Hannah was the same woman operating under a new name. That he returned to Southampton County and attempted again to warn his brother. Walter refused to listen, accusing Jonathan of jealousy and interference. The confrontation escalated into an argument that ended with Walter threatening to cut off all contact if Jonathan continued pursuing his accusations against Hannah. Jonathan made a decision that likely saved his brother's life. He secretly contacted the county sheriff and shared his suspicions. The sheriff, who had received confidential instructions to watch for any woman matching Clara's description, took Jonathan's warning seriously. He began surveillance of the Kensington plantation while preparing arrest warrants based on evidence from the previous incidents. Clara recognized the increased attention immediately. Her survival instincts, honed through multiple narrow escapes, detected the subtle changes in how people watched her during visits to Taton. She noticed the sheriff asking questions about her background under the pretext of casual conversation. She understood that her time at the Kensington plantation was ending, though she had not yet achieved her usual objective. On the night of April 7, 1852, Clara disappeared from the Kensington plantation. She left no note, took no obvious belongings, and provided no explanation. The sheriff arrived the following morning with arrest warrants only to discover she had fled during the night. A search of her rooms revealed forged free papers, stolen money, and documents she had prepared for another identity. Evidence confirming she was indeed the woman responsible for the previous fires. Walter Kensington survived because Jonathan had intervened despite his brother's resistance. But Clara had escaped again, vanishing into Virginia's complex landscape of enslaved people, free black communities, and constantly moving populations. The search for Clara consumed Virginia law enforcement through the spring and summer of 1852. Sheriffs across multiple counties received her description and instructions to watch for any woman matching her appearance. Slave patrols increased their surveillance of roads and river crossings. Planters warned each other through private correspondence to scrutinize any new domestic servants carefully. Despite these efforts, Clara seemed to have disappeared completely. Some officials speculated she had fled to northern states using the underground railroad networks that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. Others believed she had assumed a completely new identity so different from her previous personas that recognition had become impossible. A few pessimists warned that she remained in Virginia, preparing for another attack that would catch every wannabe surprise. The truth emerged during late August 1852 when federal marshals arrested a woman named Mary Hendricks in Philadelphia. Hendricks had been living in the city's black community for several months, working as a seamstress and apparently living peacefully. Her arrest resulted from a tip provided by a Virginia fugitive hunter who had recognized her despite significant changes in appearance. Authorities extradited Hendricks to Virginia for trial, transporting her in chains to Richmond, where she would face charges related to the plantation fires. During the journey, she admitted her identity as Clara while refusing to provide any additional information about her background or motives. She remained silent when questioned about the fires, offering neither confessions nor denials. The trial commenced in Richmond during October 1852, conducted with as much secrecy as legal proceedings could maintain. Virginia officials still hoped to avoid widespread publicity about the case, though rumors had spread through the plantation community about a woman responsible for multiple fires. The prosecution presented evidence connecting Clara to all 5 incidents: physical descriptions from witnesses, forged papers found in her possession, stolen money matching amounts missing from the burned plantations, and testimony from Jonathan Kensington about her suspicious behavior. Clara offered no defense. She refused to speak during the trial, sitting silently while prosecutors detailed her crimes. Her silence frustrated officials who wanted to understand her motives, background, and whether she had accomplices who might continue her work. She provided nothing, maintaining perfect stillness throughout the proceedings. The jury convicted her of murder and arson in less than 2 hours off deliberation. Virginia law mandated execution for enslaved people convicted of murdering white individuals. The judge sentenced Clara to death by hanging to be carried out within 30 days. During her final weeks in Richmond's jail, Clara remained silent despite visits from various officials hoping to extract information. A minister who attempted to offer religious comfort found her completely unresponsive. A journalist who bribed guards for access published an article describing her as a woman of unusual intelligence and complete emotional absence, showing neither remorse for her crimes nor fear of her approaching execution. The one person Clara finally spoke to was Edward Hutchinson, the Caroline County magistrate, who had first identified her pattern. He visited her cell 3 days before her scheduled execution, not to interrogate, but simply to understand. He asked her directly why had she killed those 5 men. Clara's response, recorded in Hutchinson's private journal, provided the only insight into her motive she ever offered. She told him that each man she killed represented thousands who participated in the same system of brutality and exploitation. She said that property owners who treated human beings as commodities deserved no mercy when those commodities discovered methods of resistance. She said that she had learned to exploit the greed and fear that made slavery possible, turning slaveholders' own criminal intentions against them. Most chillingly, she told Hutchinson that she had never intended to stop at 5. She had planned to continue burning plantations until she was caught or killed, believing that each fire damaged the psychological certainty that made slavery function. She wanted planters to fear every enslaved woman in their households, to recognize that the system's violence could flow in both directions. Hutchinson asked whether she regretted anything about her actions. Clara smiled, the only emotional expression witnesses ever reported seeing from her, and said she regretted only being caught before completing her work. Authorities hanged Clara on November 17, 1852 in Richmond's public execution ground. Despite official efforts to minimize publicity, several hundred spectators attended, including many enslaved people whose masters had brought them to witness the consequences of resistance. Clara walked to the gallows without assistance, maintained her silence throughout the execution proceedings, and died without offering any final statement. Virginia officials ordered her body buried in an unmarked grave at an undisclosed location. They destroyed all trial records that might provide detailed information about her methods. They continued suppressing newspaper coverage, ensuring that accounts of her execution remained brief and lacking detail. They succeeded in burying Clara's story so thoroughly that later historians found almost no documentation of her crimes or trial. What Virginia's officials could not bury was the knowledge that spread through enslaved communities across the South. Clara's story circulated through whispered conversations, coded songs, and carefully shared information passed between plantations. Enslaved people learned that resistance was possible, that slaveholders were vulnerable, that the system's apparent invincibility was an illusion. The officials who had tried to protect slavery by suppressing information about Clara's success had failed to anticipate how completely that information would spread through channels they could not control. The 5 plantation houses Clara burned never recovered. Riverside Estate in Henrico County was subdivided and sold to multiple buyers. Marcus Dalton's property in Albemarle County passed to distant relatives who abandoned it within a decade. Lawrence Pritchard children in Brunswick County sold the land and left Virginia. The Caroline County and Pennsylvania County properties similarly changed hands multiple times before eventually being abandoned or incorporated into larger holdings. The families affected by Clara's fires carried different responses. Walter Kensington, who had survived only because of his brother's intervention, sold his Southampton County plantation and moved to Richmond, where he worked in banking. He never married again and rarely spoke about the period when Hannah had worked in his household. Jonathan Kensington, whose suspicions had saved his brother's life, maintained throughout his remaining years that he had recognized something dangerous in Hannah's manner, a quality he could not precisely articulate, but which had triggered his military instincts about threat assessment. Edward Hutchinson, the magistrate who had first identified Clara's pattern and who had conducted the final conversation with her before her execution, became obsessed with understanding her background. He spent years investigating her origins, trying to determine where she had learned to read and write, where she had developed her methods, whether she had accomplices or allies. He found almost nothing. No plantation owner ever came forward acknowledging they had owned someone matching her description before she appeared in Richmond slave market in 1847. No one could identify where she had acquired her education or who might have taught her. She remained a mystery, appearing fully formed in historical records with no visible trail leading backward to her origins. The broader impact of Clarara's murders remained invisible in official records but profound in reality. Insurance companies tightened their requirements for fire insurance on plantation properties, requiring more thorough inspections and treating any suspicious fires with greater skepticism. Planters became more cautious about employing free black women in household roles, particularly educated women whose backgrounds could not be thoroughly verified. County magistrates established informal networks for sharing information about suspicious fires or concerning patterns, creating coordination that had not existed before Clarara's rampage. Most significantly, Clarara's story became part of the oral tradition circulating through enslaved communities across the South. Her name appeared in songs, stories, and whispered conversations shared in quarters after masters retired for the evening. She became a symbol of resistance. Proof that the enslaved could strike back against their oppressors successfully, even if only temporarily. The officials who had tried to suppress information about her had created a legend that spread far beyond what honest public reporting might have achieved. Historians who later examined Virginia's plantation records from the 1840s, 1850s found curious gaps and inconsistencies. Insurance investigations that started but never concluded. Their files mysteriously incomplete. The documentary evidence suggested deliberate historic erasure, though the reasons remained unclear until researchers discovered Hutchinson's private journals in the 1950s, more than a century after Clara's execution. Those journals, now preserved in the Virginia Historical Society's archives in Richmond, provide the only detailed account of Clarara's crimes, her trial, and the official conspiracy to suppress information about her. Hutchinson had maintained meticulous records despite official orders to destroy documentation. He had hidden his journals carefully, apparently believing that future generations deserved to know what had happened, even if his contemporaries had decided otherwise. The journals reveal a man deeply troubled by what he had learned. Hutchinson's final entry, written shortly before his death in 1871, expressed his belief that Clara had been shaped by slavery itself, that the system's violence had created someone capable of turning that violence back against the system's beneficiaries. Hugh wrote that he could not condone murder but found himself unable to condemn someone whose actions emerged directly from the brutality she had experienced. That he also noted in that final entry that Clarara had told him something during their last conversation that he had not shared with other officials. She had said that she was not the first enslaved person to develop these methods and she would not be the last. She said that slavery's violence created countless individuals capable of resistance, most of whom never acted on that capability, but some did act, and the system supporters would never know how many similar stories remained hidden because investigations were suppressed or evidence destroyed. Hutchinson had wondered in his final years how many other fires attributed to accidents had actually been deliberate acts of resistance. How many plantation owners died in circumstances their contemporaries accepted as tragic misfortune, but which might have been calculated revenge. He could never know because the same forces that had suppressed information about Clara Wilde have suppressed similar information about any other cases. The question remains unanswerable. Virginia's historical records contain dozens of plantation fires from the antebellum period, each attributed to accidents or natural causes. Modern historians examining these records find patterns that suggest some fires might have been deliberate, but evidence was destroyed too thoroughly to reach definitive conclusions. Clarara's story survived only because of a magistrate's decision to preserve records in defiance of official orders. What historians can say with certainty is that Clara succeeded in her primary objective even if she failed in her larger goal. She killed 5 plantation owners, exploiting their greed and fear to turn their criminal intentions against them. She demonstrated that enslaved people could successfully resist their oppressors using intelligence and planning rather than open rebellion. And she created astery that inspired others to imagine resistance as possible even when the system seemed utterly unbreakable. The unmarked grave where Virginia authorities buried Clarara's body has never been located. Researchers have searched the likely areas based on references in Hutchinson's journals, but the grave's location was deliberately obscured to prevent it from becoming a memorial site. Clara remains disappeared even in death, erased from official history while surviving in the oral traditions of the community she hoped to inspire. Her story forces confrontation with uncomfortable truths about American history. The enslaved people who lived under Virginia's plantation system experienced daily violence that justified almost any form of resistance. The plantation owners who died in Clarara's fires had participated in a system that treated human beings as property, that separated families, that employed torture and rapine as tools of control, that generated wealth through the systematic exploitation of people who had no legal recourse or protection. Clarara's methods were brutal, but they emerged from a context of far greater brutality that had existed for centuries before she took action. Virginia officials understood this moral complexity even as they executed her. They recognized that publicly acknowledging her crimes would require acknowledging the conditions that produced her. They chose suppression over honesty, believing that protecting slavery's image justified hiding evidence of resistance. Their choice meant that Clarara's story remained hidden for more than a century, known only to the communities that preserved it through oral tradition and to the magistrate who defied orders to maintain his private record. The 5 plantation houses burned. The 5 masters died. The woman responsible was executed but never forgotten. Her story survives as testimony to resistance, revenge, and the lengths people will employ to strike back against systems designed to crush them completely. Whether that story inspires or horrifies depends on which side of slavery's violence you imagine yourself standing. A question that remains deeply uncomfortable for anyone confronting America's history honestly. What lessons can we draw from Clarara's story? What does it tell us about resistance, revenge, and the moral complexities of history? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to know what you think about this disturbing chapter of American history. If you found this story as compelling and troubling as it did, hit that like button and share this video with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss stories like this. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.